Welcome to the edge of fear, where reality blurs and the shadows hold secrets you may never want to uncover. Tonight, on Farcical Fears, we bring you 12 terrifying stories, so chilling, so unnervingly real, that you might hesitate to close your eyes. These aren't just tales to scare youth, they are experiences that have haunted people long after the lights went out. From haunted cabins and forgotten mines, to cursed objects and whispers in the dark. As you listen, feel the tension creeping, the dread building, and remember, what you hear may follow you into your dreams. Don't forget to subscribe to Farcical Fears, so you never miss a story that could make your nights unforgettable. Brace yourself, because once you start, there's no turning back. Your fear begins now. Let's move to our first story. It started on an ordinary autumn evening, when a young man named Ethan decided to explore the stories whispered about the old Waverly estate at the edge of town. Rumors had swirled for decades about the abandoned mansion, that no one who ventured inside ever emerged the same, and some never returned at all. Ethan had always dismissed such tales as overactive imaginations and local folklore, but the allure of uncovering the truth gnawed at him. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest shadows stretched unnaturally long, he approached the iron gates, their rusted spikes jagged and foreboding. A chill ran down his spine despite the mild autumn air, and the distant howl of a lone dog echoed like a warning. Ethan's first step onto the estate grounds was met with the crunch of dry leaves beneath his boots, a sound that seemed far too loud in the oppressive silence surrounding him. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark and broken, and the warped doors sagged as if tired of holding back the years of neglect. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, yet curiosity propelled him forward. He remembered the stories, the faint whispers in the corridors, the shadowy figures glimpsed out of the corner of one's eye, the inexplicable cold spots, and the feeling that he was being watched. The night air grew colder as he stepped closer, the hairs on his arms prickling with anticipation and fear. Inside, the air was heavy and musty, saturated with the scent of decay and mold. Ethan's flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing walls lined with peeling wallpaper, cobwebbed chandeliers, and floorboards groaning under his weight. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, and for a moment, he swore he heard another set of footsteps behind him. He spun around, but nothing was there. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against his ears. With each step, Ethan felt a growing sense of unease, a creeping paranoia that the house itself was alive, observing him, guiding him deeper into its shadowed heart. He reached the grand staircase at the center of the house, its once opulent woodwork now splintered and decayed. As he ascended, the beam of his flashlight fell on an old portrait at the landing. A family of 4, faces painted in oil that seemed almost alive in the flickering light. Their eyes appeared to follow him, and a subtle shift in their expressions made Ethan's stomach churn. He paused, heart hammering, and swore he heard soft murmurs emanating from the walls themselves. He told himself it was his imagination, nerves, or the house settling. But a gnawing fear deep within warned him otherwise. As he explored the upper floor, he came across a long hallway lined with doors, each slightly ajar. The first room contained remnants of a child's bedroom, toys, broken furniture, and a faint scent of perfume that clung to the air like a memory. He felt a cold draft brush past him, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Panic surged, yet something compelled him to investigate further. In the corner of the room, a small mirror, clouded with age, reflected his pale, frightened face, but behind him, a shadow flickered for an instant, a figure that should not have been there, shaken. Ethan pressed onward, following a narrow spiral staircase that led to the attic. The air grew colder still, each breath visible in the dim flashlight glow. The attic was vast, filled with forgotten trunks and rotting furniture, and something about the space felt wrong, unnatural. There was a weight in the room, an invisible pressure that seemed to push him toward a particular corner. There, he found a small, dust-covered journal, bound in cracked leather. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, yet legible, filled with scrawled notes and sketches of faces, each more distorted than the last. As he read, a chilling realization dawned on him. The journal chronicled disappearances, the names and dates, eerily matching rumors he had heard about locals who had vanished in the surrounding town decades ago. A sudden thump echoed behind him, making him spin around. The air was thick with a presence, and a low whisper, unintelligible yet insistent, seemed to fill the attic. Shadows moved independently of the light, flickering unnaturally along the walls and ceiling. Ethan felt as though he were no longer alone, that the house had awakened to acknowledge his intrusion. Trembling, he tried to retreat, but the staircase seemed impossibly far, distorted, as though the attic itself were stretching and bending. Panic overtook reason as the whispering grew louder, forming syllables he could almost understand. Warning, a plea, or perhaps a curse. He stumbled backward into a trunk and fell, scattering its contents, old dolls, photographs, and strange charms. One doll lay on the floor, its glassy eyes reflecting the flashlight, unnervingly lifelike. Ethan froze as the air grew colder, and he heard a slow, deliberate step behind him. He dared not turn his head. The whispering intensified, now a chorus, of voices overlapping, some screaming, some pleading, some mocking. The journal had slipped from his hands, open to a page showing a sketch of a figure that looked unmistakably like him. Eyes wide with fear, mouth open in silent scream. Adrenaline surged, and Ethan bolted, scrambling toward the attic entrance. The house seemed to fight him, the floorboards buckling, shadows stretching to bar his path. He flung himself down the staircase, breaking into a run through the hallways that seemed to twist unnaturally. Doors slammed of their own accord, and he heard laughter, low, guttural, and echoing through every room. He burst out of the front doors into the cold night air, gasping for breath, heart racing. The mansion loomed behind him, dark and silent once more, as if nothing had happened, yet the whispers lingered in his mind, haunting every step. Ethan never returned to the Waverly estate, but the experience followed him relentlessly. At night, he hears faint scratching at the walls of his own home, whispers echoing from shadows, and sometimes glimpses a figure standing just out of view. The journal left behind had vanished, and he knows deep down that what he encountered was no mere house, it was a sentient trap, a predator that feeds on curiosity and fear. The stories of Waverly Estate were not exaggerations. Some secrets should never be uncovered, and some doors should never be opened, because once the darkness notices you, it never forgets. Let's move to our second storiette. Began with an online message that should never have been answered. Clara, a college student majoring in anthropology, had been researching abandoned places for her thesis when she stumbled upon a mysterious forum dedicated to urban exploration. Among the threads of innocuous abandoned houses and factories, one post stood out. A user had uploaded a photo of a derelict sanatorium tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, claiming it was haunted by something no one had ever documented. The post included coordinates, and despite the warnings, scrawled in the comments tales of people disappearing, strange sounds echoing through the forest, and unexplained illnesses, Clara's curiosity ignited. She packed her backpack with a flashlight, notebooks, and a camera, telling herself this would be her greatest discovery. The thrill of the unknown, the chance to document history lost to time, eclipsed every warning her instincts offered. Driving up the winding mountain roads, she felt the isolation pressing in on her like a physical weight. The sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and purple, and a creeping fog began to roll down the valleys. Clara's GPS led her to a narrow, overgrown trail, barely visible beneath fallen leaves and twisted roots. When she finally glimpsed the sanatorium through the thinning mist, her stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and unease. The building was colossal, its white paint chipped and blackened with mold, windows either broken or boarded up, and the once grand entrance sagging with decay. There was a silence so profound that even the distant chirping of birds seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The moment she stepped onto the property, a cold draft slithered across her skin, and she felt a tingling at the base of her neck. Clara dismissed it as the mountain chill and pressed forward, noting the eerie symmetry of the building's architecture. The main hallway stretched before her, long and dim, with tiles cracked and peeling. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, and a sudden sound of metallic clatter from somewhere deep within the structure made her jump. She told herself it was nothing, just the building settling, but every instinct screamed otherwise. The smell of damp earth and rot clung to the air, and faint, indistinguishable whispers seemed to curl around her ears, teasing the edge of comprehension. Clara's flashlight illuminated peeling signs and faded labels, indicating rooms that had once been used for medical treatments: isolation ward, psychiatric observation, pediatric wing. The air grew colder as she progressed, and she noticed small details that made her uneasy: strange scratches along the walls, dark stains that could not be explained by water damage, and remnants of old furniture that seemed deliberately arranged, almost ritualistically. When she entered the former patient records room, she discovered stacks of yellowed files, each containing names and dates. Some of the entries had handwritten notes in the margins, warnings to stay away, or cryptic phrases like "he watches and don't look back." As she explored deeper, Clara felt a growing sense of being observed. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, lengthening in impossible directions, and faint sounds like the scrape of shoes across tiles, or the soft sigh of someone exhaling, echoed in spaces where no one could be. When she reached the upper floors, the air thickened, carrying the faint, metallic scent of blood, though no visible wounds existed anywhere. Her camera flickered intermittently, capturing brief, inexplicable blurs, shapes that resembled figures, but dissolved when she focused. Panic and fascination warred inside her. She tried to convince herself she was imagining it, but a persistent, low hum vibrated through the walls, as if the building itself were alive and breathing. She entered a long, narrow hallway lined with doors that seemed almost identical, each one slightly ajar. The first room she explored had a child's bed, small and aged, with toys scattered across the floor, eerily intact despite years of decay. As she examined the toys, she heard soft, deliberate footsteps behind her. Clara froze, and the footsteps stopped. Holding her breath, she spun around, but no one was there. Her heart pounded, yet something urged her onward, deeper into the bowels of the sanatorium. In the next room, she found old medical instruments, rusted and crooked, arranged meticulously on a counter, as if someone had just stepped away. A sudden breeze caused the door to slam, and the whispers rose into incoherent voices that seemed to circle around her. Pressing into her mind, in the final wing of the upper floor, Clara discovered an abandoned therapy room. A large mirror hung crookedly on the wall, reflecting her pale, terrified face back behind her. She could see the faint, blurred outline of a figure crouched, watching. She screamed, spinning around, but the figure vanished, leaving only shadows. The mirror, however, now showed more than just her reflection. Dark shapes moved behind her, twisting, writhing, reaching. Panic surged through her veins, and she realized that leaving would not be as simple as retracing her steps. The hallway seemed longer, doors shifted locations, and her flashlight beam danced unpredictably, as if the building itself were manipulating reality. Clara's breaths came in ragged gasps as she stumbled down the stairs, each creak of the old wood echoing like a scream. She reached the main hallway, only to find that the exit she had come through no longer led outside. Windows appeared blacked out, doors had transformed into solid walls, and the oppressive sense of being hunted intensified. The whispers turned into voices, distinct now, chanting her name. Desperation fueled her movements as she tried to break a window, only for the glass to feel unnaturally thick, unyielding. Like a barrier she could not overcome. Hours or perhaps minutes passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Clara's camera began recording of its own accord, capturing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, glowing eyes in the dark, and the faintest outlines of people frozen in silent terror. It became clear that the sanatorium was more than abandoned. It was alive in a way that defied reason, feeding on curiosity, fear, and the trespass of the unwary. With every attempt to escape, the building shifted, corridors twisting and stretching impossibly, doors appearing and disappearing. Eventually, Clara collapsed in an old lounge, too exhausted to continue. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, leaning closer, whispering secrets she could almost understand. Images flashed through her mind, fragments of past visitors, their expressions frozen in horror, their fates sealed. She realized that the sanatorium had drawn her in, marking her as another story for its walls. Though she eventually stumbled out at first light, the experience never left her. Whispers continued in her ears, fleeting shadows haunted her periphery, and sometimes she caught a reflection in a window that wasn't her own. The Appalachian Mountains kept their secrets well, and Clara had learned the hard way that curiosity could lead to a terror beyond comprehension. Let's move to our third story. It began on a quiet evening in the small town of Millhaven, a place that seemed innocent on the surface, but had been the setting of countless whispers about things best left unspoken. Lucas, a freelance journalist, with a fascination for the macabre, had received an anonymous tip about a series of mysterious disappearances tied to the old Northbrook Mill, an abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of town. According to the tip, the factory wasn't just deserted, it was a site where people had gone missing, often after claiming to hear strange noises, see shadowy figures, or feel an oppressive presence pressing in on them. Lucas had a habit of investigating such stories, driven by a desire to uncover truths that no one else dared touch. That night, he packed his recorder, flashlight, and notebook. Convinced that he could capture evidence of something extraordinary, the factory loomed. As he approached it, skeletal and blackened by years of neglect and fires that had partially gutted the structure, rusted machinery loomed like the carcass of some mechanical beast, and the air smelled of damp metal, mold, and decay. The closer Lucas got, the more he felt an inexplicable weight in the atmosphere, as if the building itself were watching him, analyzing him, waiting. A cold breeze whispered through the broken windows, carrying faint echoes that might have been distant laughter, or Crisbut. The darkness made it impossible to tell. Undeterred, Lucas stepped inside, his footsteps echoing unnaturally against the concrete floors. Every sound magnified by the cavernous interior. Inside, the factory was a maze of decaying machinery, rusted catwalks, and endless corridors lined with peeling paint. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist at the edges of his vision, forming vague shapes that disappeared when he tried to focus on them. His flashlight illuminated broken conveyor belts, shattered windows, and remnants of workers' tools, all frozen in time, yet the air felt alive with anticipation, thick and suffocating. As he explored, Lucas began hearing noises, faint metallic scraping, the hiss of something moving in the shadows, and whispers that seemed just beyond comprehension. At first, he tried to rationalize the animals trapped inside the wind, but soon realized that the sounds were deliberate, almost sentient. Lucas discovered a staircase leading to the upper levels of the factory. As he ascended, he noticed scratches along the walls, some forming patterns that resembled symbols or letters, though they made no sense to him. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the dim light, and the oppressive feeling intensified. At the top, he found an old office, papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned. A ledger lay open on the desk, filled with names, dates, and notes. Some entries were ordinary, while others detailed odd occurrences, people vanishing, machinery moving on its own, strange shadows observed by workers. One particular entry, dated decades ago, bore Lucas's own name, written in a hand that seemed impossibly familiar, though he knew he had never seen it before. A sudden metallic clang echoed through the factory, making him jump. Lucas's flashlight flickered, revealing a shadow darting along the wall, moving with impossible speed. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Panic surged, yet a strange compulsion drew him deeper into the factory, toward the center where the largest machines stood. Here, the darkness seemed to thicken, absorbing the beam of his flashlight, swallowing him in its oppressive weight. Lucas felt a presence behind him, cold and immense, and though he spun around, the space was empty yet. The air hummed with malevolent intent. He pressed on, entering the main floor where massive looms and spinning machines once worked tirelessly. Now they were still, yet the sense of movement persisted. Shadows crawled across the machinery, forming vague humanoid shapes that twisted unnaturally. Whispers became voices clear enough to understand fragments. Leave. Stay. Witness. Lucas realized that the factory itself was alive, a vessel for something that thrived on fear and attention. Each step he took seemed to echo endlessly, creating multiple shadows of himself that moved independently, taunting and circling him. In one corner, he found an old locker room. The lockers were dented, rusted, and covered in strange stains that Lucas couldn't identify. Inside one locker lay a small journal, its pages filled with frantic handwriting, confessions of people who had entered the factory before him, describing the same oppressive presence, the whispers, and the shadows. Some claimed to have seen people from their past, or distorted versions of themselves, urging them to stay, to join the darkness. One page contained a rough sketch of a figure, cloaked and indistinct, surrounded by a swarm of smaller shadows, which Lucas instinctively knew represented the lost souls of the factory. A sudden gust of wind slammed doors across the factory, extinguishing his flashlight. Darkness engulfed him, and Lucas felt icy hands brush his shoulders, trailing along his arms. Panic made him stumble backward, his hands brushing against the cold metal of the looms. In the blackness, the whispers became screaming, layered and overlapping, echoing from every corner of the factory. He could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes upon him, watching, judging, feeding. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the building itself seemed to stretch, corridors twisting and warping impossibly, disorienting him at every turn. Lucas eventually found himself in the central atrium of the factory, a vast open space where the roof had partially caved in, moonlight streaming through the gaps. Shadows swirled unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled people, faces frozen in silent terror, arms reaching as if to pull him into their darkness. The whispers now formed coherent words, speaking directly into his mind, recounting every moment of fear, every doubt, every curiosity that had led him here. He realized that the factory did not merely trap people. It consumed them, feeding on their attention, their fear, leaving nothing but a husk behind. Desperation propelled Lucas to search for an exit. Every door he tried led him to another part of the factory, twisting and elongating the hallways as if the building itself were alive. His flashlight flickered back on, revealing walls etched with more symbols, some resembling human figures trapped within cages, screaming silently. The air grew colder with each step, frost forming on his clothes, and the whispers turned into chants, calling his name over and over. He understood that the factory wanted him to stay, to become part of its collection, a witness to feed the darkness in a last-ditch effort. Lucas sprinted toward a large garage door that appeared to lead outside. The shadows converged, forming grotesque faces, reaching hands, and eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. His body screamed in terror, but he pushed forward, heart hammering, mind overwhelmed by the cacophony of whispers and screams. Just as he reached the door, it slammed shut in front of him, throwing him backward. He barely had time to grab the edge of a support beam before the shadows surged around him. When he finally broke through and stumbled into the moonlit night, the factory loomed silently behind him, seemingly inert. His breath came in ragged gasps, limbs shaking uncontrollably. He glanced back, half expecting the shadows to spill from the broken windows and reach for him. But the building was still. Lucas realized he had escaped, but the whispers lingered in his mind, echoing in the corners of his thoughts, a permanent reminder that the factory's reach extended far beyond its walls. Even now, he could feel eyes on him, the shadows following him through every dark alley and empty room, reminding him that some places were better left forgotten. Let's move to our fourth story yet. Started with an email that appeared in Jonathan's inbox at precisely 2:17 a.m., though he didn't recall subscribing to the sender. The subject line was simple: "Do you want to know what haunts the old Winthrop Asylum?" Jonathan, a paranormal blogger with a growing following, had always been skeptical of ghost stories, preferring to explore abandoned places with a camera and logical explanations. Yet the email contained an attachment, a grainy photograph of a hallway lined with rusted wheelchairs and decaying furniture, lit only by a faint, unidentifiable glow. The eerie sense of familiarity he felt upon seeing the photo sent chills down his spine. The building had been condemned for decades, and many locals swore it was cursed after several patients vanished under mysterious circumstances. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a professional need for content, Jonathan decided to investigate. Arriving at the asylum in the early evening, he found the entrance blocked by sagging metal gates. Rusted signage creaked in the wind, warning of trespassing, yet he found a gap at the side, enough to squeeze through. The forest surrounding the building seemed unnaturally quiet, the trees gnarled and twisted, branches clawing at the sky. A damp, cold air pressed against him as he approached the main doors, which hung slightly ajar. Jonathan felt the first wave of anisea air inside, smelled of mold, rust, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Shadows danced along the walls, though the sun was still above the horizon, and he realized the asylum seemed to consume light, as if darkness was a tangible presence. Stepping inside, Jonathan's flashlight revealed long corridors, peeling paint, and walls covered in ancient notices warning staff and patients of strict regulations. He could see rooms that had once been patient wards, each containing remnants of life frozen in time, overturned beds, rusted for stands, and notebooks left behind with ink faded to near invisibility. The stillness was oppressive. Even the smallest sound, his breathing, the scrape of his shoes against tile, echoed like thunder. Somewhere deep inside, he felt eyes watching him, a weight on his chest that grew heavier with every step. He tried to rationalize it, the building's acoustics, his imagination, but the sensation persisted, gnawing at his resolve. Jonathan moved toward the basement, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't explain. The staircase spiraled downward, shadows pooling in the corners, and a faint humming sound, almost like a chant, reverberated through the walls. Each step he took echoed unnaturally, and he realized that the architecture of the asylum seemed to twist subtly behind him, the stairs stretching longer than they should, doors appearing and disappearing along the hallway. In the basement, he found rows of old patient rooms, each door slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. One door, in particular, drew his attention. Beyond it was darkness so complete it seemed almost liquid, absorbing the beam of his flashlight. Inside, the room was filled with wheelchairs arranged in a perfect circle, their wheels frozen in rust, but the air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something almost alive. A faint scratching began at the far wall, growing louder and rhythmic. Jonathan's pulse quickened. The scratching resolved into words, carved into the wall. "Leave now, or stay forever." Goosebumps covered his skin as he noticed faint shadows, shifting along the edges of the circle, almost imperceptibly. He could swear one of the wheelchairs had moved slightly since he entered, though no one else was there. Panic mingled with fascination, compelling him to stay, to observe, to document the inexplicable phenomena. The air suddenly grew colder, and the whispers began. At first, they were soft, almost playful, teasing him, saying his name, questioning why he had come. Then they grew insistent, forming sentences he could not fully comprehend. Shadows lengthened, unnaturally, crawling along the walls, merging with each other, forming indistinct humanoid shapes. Jonathan felt a sudden pressure behind his eyes, a nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. He turned to leave, but the basement seemed impossibly vast now. Doors that had once led to hallways now opened into empty voids, and every corridor he tried seemed to lead him deeper into the asylum's bowels. In one of the rooms, he discovered a patient ledger, yellowed and fragile. Names, dates, and cryptic notes filled every page. Some entries recounted odd behaviors, patients speaking to invisible entities, refusing food, vanishing from their beds, only to return days later, altered in ways no doctor could explain. One particular entry made Jonathan's blood run cold. It detailed a patient who had looked into a mirror and disappeared, leaving behind only a faint reflection of themselves, trapped between worlds. He felt a chill as he glanced at a cracked mirror in the corner of the room, half expecting to see his reflection distort in unnatural ways. As he explored, Jonathan became aware that the asylum was feeding on him, on his fear, curiosity, and the mere act of noticing. Shadows shifted to mirror his movements. Whispers echoed his thoughts, and every attempt to escape was thwarted as hallways looped back impossibly. He realized that the asylum was sentient in some way, a living entity, sustained by the terror of those who entered. Each step was a negotiation, a delicate dance to avoid provoking the malevolent presence fully. The floor beneath him creaked with life, and faint forms seemed to press through the walls. Curious and hungry for acknowledgement, hours or perhaps minutes later, Jonathan found himself in the central hall. A massive space with vaulted ceilings and remnants of old chandeliers hanging precariously. The walls were adorned with faded murals of past patients, grotesque caricatures of life in the asylum, each figure seemingly watching him with hollow eyes. The whispers reached a crescendo, voices overlapping, some laughing, some pleading, some screaming in silent agony. He noticed a shadow detach from the wall, gliding toward him with deliberate intent. Panic surged, yet he could not move quickly enough. The entity brushed past him, icy and intangible, leaving a trail of despair that sank deep into his chest. Desperation pushed Jonathan to the main exit. He ran through twisting hallways, staircases that seemed to descend and ascend at the same time, and doors that led nowhere. The asylum was no longer just a building, it was a labyrinth of fear, a living nightmare designed to entrap those who dared enter. Finally, he burst through the main doors into the moonlit night, gasping for breath, limbs shaking uncontrollably. Behind him, the asylum loomed silently, seemingly inert. He knew, however, that it was waiting, patient, biding its time for the next curious soul to wander inside. Though Jonathan escaped physically, the asylum left its mark. Whispers haunted him in quiet moments. Shadows followed him at the periphery of his vision, and sometimes he could feel the brush of cold fingers against his skin when no one was there. The experience had changed him irrevocably, reinforcing the truth he had once denied. Some places are not abandoned. They are alive, and they feed on those who dare intrude. Let's move to our fifth story. Began with a rumor whispered among hikers and campers near the remote mountains of Grapevine, a range that locals avoided after sunset. The legend spoke of a mysterious cabin that appeared only to those who were truly lost either in spirit or direction, and those who entered never returned the same. Sophia, an experienced survivalist and travel blogger, had heard the story from a fellow hiker during her journey through the dense forests of Grapevine. Intrigued but skeptical, she decided to investigate, curious to see if there was any truth to the whispered tales. Equipped with a backpack, journal, and flashlight, she ventured deeper into the forest, following trails that seemed ordinary at first, but gradually grew unfamiliar and tangled. As night fell, the forest changed. Shadows stretched unnaturally. Beneath towering pines, the wind whispered in voices that seemed to echo her own thoughts, and the temperature dropped sharply. The path she had been following vanished into darkness, replaced by an unsettling stillness. It was then she saw it, a small cabin, oddly pristine, with smoke curling from its chimney, despite no visible firewood nearby. The structure radiated an aura of quiet menace, as if it existed outside of time, untouched by the decay of the forest around it. Curiosity and unease warred within her, but she approached. Drawn by the inexplicable pull of the place, the cabin door creaked open with minimal effort, revealing an interior frozen in time. Dust covered every surface, yet the furniture appeared recently used. A kettle on the stove, a chair slightly pulled back from the table. The walls were adorned with old photographs, each depicting people whose faces were blurred, their expressions twisted in subtle anguish. A faint scratching sound echoed from the far corner, and Sophia realized she could feel a presence, something observing her from just beyond the edge of perception. She forced herself to calm down, convincing herself that the forest, the wind, and her imagination were playing tricks. But as she explored, the sensation grew stronger, a weight pressing on her chest and tugging at the edges of her mind. On the kitchen table lay a journal, its leather cover worn but strangely unmarked by time. Opening it, Sophia found the handwriting belonged to someone who had been documenting their experiences in the cabin over decades, perhaps centuries. The entries described similar occurrences: travelers entering, feeling watched, shadows moving independently, whispers in the dead of night. One entry chilled her blood, and account of a mirror that, once looked into, showed a version of oneself that did not blink, that smiled when the observer did not. The journal warned that the cabin was not merely a place, but a trap, feeding on attention, fear, and curiosity. Sophia's pulse quickened, but the allure of uncovering the truth kept her rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the scratching intensified, resolving into faint deliberate taps, as if someone or something was trying to communicate. Sophia's flashlight flickered, revealing shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. The photographs seemed to shift, the blurred faces twisting into expressions of terror as their eyes followed her movements. Panic set in, but rational thought fought back. This was a cabin, and cabins had logical explanations. Yet the whispers began, soft at first, then louder, forming words that called her name, taunted her, questioned her presence. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the door she had entered through seemed impossibly far away, the cabin stretching in impossible dimensions. Exploring further, Sophia found a bedroom with a large, cracked mirror dominating one wall. The reflection stared back at her with a subtle difference, her eyes darker, her smile unnatural. As she blinked, the figure in the mirror raised a hand of its own accord, pointing toward the forest. Fear paralyzed her, but curiosity edged her forward. Suddenly, a cold gust extinguished her flashlight, and she was plunged into complete darkness. The whispers became a cacophony, echoing from all directions, overlapping, repeating, mocking her. Sophia felt icy hands brush her shoulders, and she realized she was no longer alone. Desperation drove her to the back door of the cabin. She flung it open, expecting the forest, but found herself in a mirror image of the cabin's interior looping corridor. Walls and floors identical, trapping her in a repeating nightmare. Each turn revealed new photographs, journal entries that she hadn't seen before, and shadows that seemed to anticipate her movements. The cabin, she understood, was alive in some malevolent way, feeding on attention and fear, manipulating reality to ensnare her. Her pulse raced as she ran blindly, the whispers becoming voices she recognized: friends, family, voices she had trusted, each urging her to stop, to stay, after what felt like hours. Though time seemed meaningless within the cabin, Sophia stumbled into a large hall, the air thick with a cold, almost sentient presence. She noticed dozens of chairs, each occupied by shadowy figures whose faces were faint imprints of travelers who had vanished before her. Some moved subtly, watching her, while others remained frozen, eyes empty yet piercing. Panic surged. She realized that she could become one of them if she did not escape. Summoning every ounce of courage, she sprinted toward a faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through a cracked window. The shadows surged, attempting to slow her, whispering threats, luring her back. But determination propelled her forward. Finally, she broke through a side door and emerged into the moonlit forest. The cabin was gone, replaced by dense trees and uneven terrain. Her lungs burned as she ran without looking back, branches scratching her face, thorns tearing at her clothes. The whispers lingered, faint yet unmistakable, following her through the forest, echoing in the rustling leaves. By dawn, Sophia had reached a familiar trail, her body trembling, mind racing. She realized she had escaped physically, but the cabin had left its mark. Phantoms of the experience haunted her dreams. Shadows creeping in the corners of her vision, whispers calling her name in moments of solitude. Though the cabin could not touch her now, it had imprinted itself upon her consciousness, leaving her with a permanent sense of unease. She knew the truth that many deny. Some places are sentient, and some legends are not merely stories, they are warnings. The Grapevine cabin, she understood, was alive, a living predator in the guise of wood and stone, waiting for the next lost soul drawn by curiosity, bravery, or folly. Even now, when the wind rustled the trees outside her cabin at home, she would hear faint whispers, reminding her that the line between safety and terror can be broken in an instant, and that some curiosities are better left unexamined. Let's move to our sixth story. It began with a series of strange phone calls that Mara received at her small apartment in the outskirts of Dunridge, a town known for its old, decaying factories and whispered legends. The calls were always silent. At first, filled only with the faint hum of static and background noises, she couldn't place footsteps on wooden floors. Distant whispers, and a door creaking open. Over time, the calls grew longer, and she began to hear a voice, a low, distorted murmur that seemed to echo her own fears back at her. Her friends dismissed it as a prank, something easily explained, but Mara could feel the presence of someone, or something observing her, waiting for her to let her guard down. Each night, the phone rang at precisely 3:03 a.m., and each time, her sense of dread deepened. She tried to change numbers, switch carriers, and even install security systems. Yet the calls persisted, always reaching her in moments of solitude. Eventually, she noticed patterns within the static words and phrases forming in the distortion. Sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. The voice seemed to know intimate details of her life, past regrets, and hidden fears. Mara realized that these calls were not random. They were deliberate, almost methodical, as if the unseen entity was studying her, mapping her behavior, waiting for an opportune moment. One night, after hours of listening to the static, she could hear faint laughter, then a whisper, "I see you." It was the first time she felt true terror. Mara decided to investigate the origin of the calls. Using her limited knowledge of telecommunications, she traced the line through several convoluted networks, only to find that the source was not a single location. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The numbers were invalid, the carrier lines non-existent, yet the calls were undeniably reaching her. She started documenting each instance, writing down the patterns, recording the sounds, hoping to find a logical explanation. But the more she listened, the more the static seemed to infiltrate her thoughts, forming shadows in her mind, making her question what was real. Weeks passed, and the entity escalated its actions. She began noticing objects in her apartment, subtly moved books, shifted slightly on shelves. Her furniture arranged differently, her laptop screen displaying distorted images of places she had never been. The calls became more aggressive, the whispers louder, forming sentences that made her stomach churn. "You cannot hide. I am inside. We are watching." Mara's sleep became fragmented, her dreams invaded by visions of shadowy figures moving through her apartment, sometimes reaching out toward her while she lay paralyzed. Her mental state deteriorated. Even during the day, she felt eyes on her, a pervasive sensation of being stalked. One night, the calls stopped, but the silence was worse. Mara awoke to find a note on her pillow, written in faintly dripping ink that seemed wet to the touch. "Check the basement." Dunridge apartments rarely had basements, but this one did. A narrow, claustrophobic crawlspace used for storage. Trembling, she descended the stairs, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and mold. At the far end, she found her phone, ringing silently, its screen displaying a live feed of her apartment, from a perspective that should have been impossible. On the screen, a shadow moved independently of any person she had seen, gliding toward the door, reaching for the camera, the static morphing into a distorted face, staring directly at her. Mara attempted to destroy the phone, smashing it against the concrete walls, but it would not break. The whispers now seemed to emanate not just from the device but from the very walls, the floors, the air itself. Her apartment, her safe haven, had become a conduit for the entity's influence. Desperate, she left her home, wandering the streets of Dunridge, in the dead of night, hoping that distance would sever the connection. Yet even as she walked past the empty factories and abandoned warehouses, she could hear faint echoes of the calls, whispers following her every step. Images of the distorted face flashing in reflective surfaces, windows, puddles, even the chrome of a parked car, in the days that followed. Mara tried to seek help, reporting the occurrences to authorities, friends, even online forums for paranormal phenomena. No one believed her. Every explanation she offered was dismissed. Faulty wiring, pranksters, stress-induced hallucinations. But Mara knew the truth. The entity was real, intelligent, and patient. It thrived on fear and observation, manipulating reality to maintain its connection. The boundaries between technology, space, and perception no longer existed. The entity could reach her anywhere, at any time. Sleep became impossible. She found herself waking at odd hours, driven by compulsion to check her phone, to listen for the whispers, to verify that she was still alive, still herself. Then, one night, Mara received a call unlike any before. Instead of static, she heard her own voice, clear but distorted, speaking. "You're next." The phone slipped from her hands, yet the voice continued, echoing from every surface around her. Shadows coalesced in the corners of the room, forming vaguely humanoid figures that flickered and disappeared when she tried to focus. Panic overtook her. She ran out into the empty streets, the cold wind biting at her skin. Yet every street, every alley seemed distorted, looping back upon itself. She realized the entity had no need to physically manifest it, had warped her perception, enveloped her consciousness, and was now inescapable. Eventually, Mara vanished. Friends and family reported her missing, her apartment left untouched, save for her phone, lying on the floor, screen flickering with static. Those who tried to retrieve it heard the whispers, felt the cold, and claimed they saw fleeting shadowy figures in the corners of their vision. Mara's story became another whisper in Dunridge, another legend warning the curious and the skeptical. Technology is not neutral, and some forces can manipulate the very tools meant to connect us, turning them into instruments of fear. The entity that haunted Mara, however, remained patient, waiting for the next person to answer a call in the dead of night, to see a shadow and a reflection, to hear a whisper they cannot ignore. Let's move to our seventh story. It began with a simple curiosity, a rumor about the abandoned Ashwood Sanitarium, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of a forgotten town, known for its dark history of unethical experiments and sudden, unexplained closures. Local teenagers whispered about patients who never left, and staff who vanished into the shadows, leaving the building as a decaying tomb of human suffering. Jordan, a young investigative journalist with a penchant for the paranormal, decided to explore the site, eager to document its secrets and perhaps uncover a story that would cement his reputation. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a notebook, and his camera, he stepped into the overgrown grounds one chilly evening, the sky above heavy with the threat of rain. The sanitarium was imposing, its walls scarred with peeling paint and graffiti, windows shattered or blackened with grime. A pervasive sense of sorrow and malevolence clung to the air, as if the building itself resented intruders. As Jordan explored, he noticed small anomalies, faint whispers bouncing off the walls, fleeting shadows that seemed just outside the beam of his flashlight, and doors that creaked open despite no wind. His camera picked up static-filled images of figures that weren't visible to the naked eye, their faces contorted in silent screams. It became apparent quickly that Ashwood was not just abandoned, it was alive in its own sinister way, feeding on attention and fear. Inside, the corridors were labyrinthine, twisting in ways that defied memory. Each step echoed, yet the sounds often preceded his own movements, creating the unsettling feeling that he was being followed. He entered a room marked observation and found old medical charts and patient files scattered across the floor. The documents detailed bizarre treatments, sensory deprivation, psychological conditioning, and notes that hinted at a growing awareness in the subjects themselves. The scribbles in the margins were frantic, sometimes pleading, sometimes warning. They are watching. Do not look into the mirrors. Jordan felt a shiver run down his spine as he glanced at the cracked mirror propped against the wall. His reflection seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second after his own actions. Hours passed, though time became meaningless within Ashwood's walls. Jordan discovered a locked room with a faint, unnatural glow seeping from beneath the door. Using a crowbar, he forced it open and stepped inside. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the walls were lined with small cells, each containing remnants of old equipment and decayed furniture. As he moved further, he noticed inscriptions etched into the walls, names, dates, cryptic symbols, and ominous phrases. The temperature dropped further, and a dense fog formed within the room, reducing visibility to mere inches. He could hear soft scratching and low moans emanating from the corners. The most chilling moment came when Jordan spotted a figure in the fog, a patient, long deceased, yet moving with unsettling purpose. Its eyes were hollow, its movements jerky, as if controlled by unseen strings. The entity seemed to beckon him deeper into the room, and Jordan, despite every instinct, screaming to flee, felt an irresistible pull toward it. He followed, documenting everything, until he reached the center of the room, where a single chair faced a broken observation mirror. On the chair lay a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Opening it, Jordan read accounts of individuals who had entered Ashwood and had been trapped in a state between life and death, forced to relive their worst fears endlessly. The final page contained a chilling warning. Do not leave your curiosity unchecked. The walls remember, the floors remember, the mirrors remember. We see everything. Suddenly, the fog thickened, and the figure approached, stopping mere inches from Jordan. He felt icy hands graze his arms, and a whisper echoed in his ears. You should not be here. Panic surged, and he ran blindly through the maze-like corridors, yet every turn seemed to lead him back to the observation room. Shadows stretched and warped, taking forms that resembled patients from the old files, each silently screaming, reaching out, pleading, cursing. The building itself seemed to constrict around him, forcing him to confront every fear, every regret he had ever buried. Hours or was it days, passed as Jordan navigated the endless hallways. He began to lose sense of reality, of who he was, and why he had come. Faces appeared in mirrors and windows, not his own, but distorted versions of himself, older, wounded, and terrified. He realized that Ashwood Sanitarium was not merely a building. It was a living entity, a nexus for suffering, feeding on curiosity and fear, extending its influence to ensnare those who dared enter. The whispers now became voices, and they spoke in unison. Stay, join us, become one of us. Jordan's heart pounded as he tried to escape, but every doorway led back to the same observation room, the chair, and the journal, in a desperate act. He ripped pages from the journal, scattering them across the floor, hoping to disrupt the entity's control. The fog swirled violently, and the figure lunged but then froze, its hollow eyes locking with his own. Jordan felt an overwhelming sense of being observed, judged, and tested. Using every ounce of courage, he sprinted toward a faint light at the end of a long hallway. The floor seemed to tilt, walls bending, and yet he ran, driven by sheer will to survive. When he finally emerged, he found himself outside, the night sky above, drenched in rain, and the building looming silently behind him, as if nothing had happened. Though he had escaped physically, the impact of Ashwood lingered. His dreams were haunted by endless corridors, whispers, and hollow faces. Every reflective surface reminded him of the figure in the fog, and the journal had imprinted itself on his mind, its warnings repeating in a loop. Jordan realized that Ashwood Sanitarium did not merely trap bodies, it ensnared minds, and its influence could extend beyond the building itself. He returned to the town of Dunridge, a changed man, forever aware that some places are sentient, that curiosity can be a dangerous temptation, and that shadows sometimes remember more than we do. Let's move to our 8th story. Started innocently enough, with an old, seemingly harmless board game that Thomas found tucked away in a dusty corner of his grandfather's attic. The box was faded and frayed at the edges, labeled simply as the Game of Shadows, its intricate illustrations depicting twisted figures dancing in candlelight. Curiosity, and the promise of a nostalgic discovery, compelled him to bring it down to his apartment and examine it, unaware that the artifact carried a malevolent presence. As he opened the box, a faint musty smell of decayed paper and old wood wafted out, and the pieces inside seemed almost to live tiny figures carved from blackened wood, their faces contorted in agony. Thomas decided to play the game alone, curious about the mechanics, which involved rolling dice, moving the pieces along a winding path, and reading phrases inscribed on cards. At first, the game seemed innocuous, almost whimsical, with the pieces moving smoothly and the cards offering cryptic but harmless advice. But as the night progressed, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The shadows in his apartment deepened unnaturally, and the air grew thick, almost oppressive. Every dice roll seemed to align with subtle changes in his surroundings, objects slightly shifting position, shadows stretching in impossible directions, faint whispers that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. By the 3rd round, Thomas realized that the cards were no longer innocent prompts, but directives that mirrored his own thoughts and fears. One card read, "You cannot escape what watches you." Immediately, he felt a chill crawl down his spine and noticed the corner of the room seemed darker than the rest, almost pulsating with movement. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to imagination, but the dice clattered across the table with unnatural force, stopping on a number that seemed to dictate his next action. Every turn brought more disturbing messages. Someone is behind you. The darkness remembers your name. Do not look away. Hours bled together as Thomas's sense of time deteriorated. The game seemed to adapt to him, anticipating his thoughts and fears. The carved figures began to move subtly, on their own, and shadows coalesced into vague humanoid shapes, writhing and whispering. When he glanced at a mirror across the room, he saw fleeting images of himself, distorted and contorted, mouthing words he had not spoken. Panic set in, but he felt a compulsion to continue playing, as if the game demanded completion. Attempting to set it aside only caused the pieces to animate violently, scattering themselves across the table and floor. As the night deepened, Thomas's apartment seemed to warp, walls stretching, shadows lengthening into impossible angles. The whispers grew louder, forming phrases that directly addressed him. You belong to the game. Every choice binds you tighter. He tried to destroy the box, striking it with a hammer, but it remained intact, its contents unharmed, resisting any force applied. Desperation overtook him as he realized that the game of shadows was sentient, feeding on his fear, learning his psyche, and manipulating reality itself. The room became an arena for psychological torment, each shadow and whisper a manifestation of his deepest anxieties. Thomas's hallucinations intensified. He saw figures in corners that disappeared when confronted directly. Walls etched with words that were not there moments before. Roll again, or remain forever. His reflection in the mirror split into multiple faces, each mouthing warnings or screaming silently. Sleep was impossible, for the game persisted even when he closed his eyes, invading dreams with scenarios designed to elicit terror and helplessness. He attempted to call for help, but the phone refused to connect. Each call went unanswered, echoing only his own terrified voice. By the early hours of the morning, Thomas realized that every movement he made, every decision, had consequences dictated by the game. A card instructed, "Light the candle to see the truth." He obeyed, and found that the flame revealed horrific images around his apartment figures, bound and contorted, shadows writhing, and glimpses of previous players trapped in eternal torment. The game's influence extended beyond the board, permeating the very air, and he could feel the malevolent presence following him, feeding on his fear, anticipating his reactions, and bending reality around him. Hours turned into an unmeasurable stretch of time. Thomas's sanity frayed as he attempted to flee the apartment, only to find every exit blocked by shifting shadows and opaque darkness. The game's pieces moved toward him of their own accord, circling, advancing with purpose. Every object, every sound, every reflection became a tool of the game, designed to entrap him further. He realized, with mounting horror, that the box itself was a gateway, a nexus between the physical world and a realm that thrived on terror and manipulation. The game was not just a pastime, it was a predator, intelligent and patient. In a final act of desperation, Thomas attempted to destroy himself along with the game, smashing the pieces and the box into a fire, but the objects reformed, unscathed, as if mocking his efforts. Shadows engulfed him, whispers became screams, and he felt his own identity fragmenting, merging with the malevolent essence within the game. When the morning light finally touched the apartment, there was no sign of Thomas, only the box, lying innocuously on the table, its cover slightly ajar, awaiting the curiosity of the next victim. Those who stumbled upon it later reported a lingering sense of dread, a whisper in the corner of their minds, and the faint movement of carved figures that seemed alive, watching, waiting. Let's move to our ninth story. It was a bitter winter evening when Rachel received an unexpected email with the subject line, "Do you want to see the truth?" The message contained only a single link and no sender information. Curiosity overpowered caution, and despite a lingering unease, she clicked it. The link directed her to a live video feed of a remote cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. At first, The footage appeared, mundane snow-laden trees swaying. The cabin quiet and dark, but a faint shadow flickered across a window, vanishing almost immediately. Rachel dismissed it as a trick of the camera or a stray animal, yet a cold shiver ran down her spine. Over the following nights, the emails multiplied, each containing more cryptic messages and links to live feeds from different isolated locations. All seemingly abandoned, but each harboring something hidden, something watching. The locations shared a common thread. They were all sites of mysterious disappearances and unsolved deaths. Compelled by a mix of fear and fascination, Rachel documented everything. Noticing a strange pattern in the timing of the feeds, at the stroke of midnight, the shadows became more pronounced, moving independently. And objects would shift subtly, as though guided by unseen hands. Rachel's sleep became fragmented. Her dreams invaded by distorted versions of the cabins she had viewed. The shadows from the feeds manifested in her dreams, whispering unintelligible phrases that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. She began hearing faint echoes in her apartment that mirrored the sounds from the stream's creaking floorboards. Whispers, distant footsteps. Her friends noticed her growing paranoia, the way she flinched at shadows or avoided looking out windows. But when she tried to explain the emails and live feeds, no one seemed to understand. Even her computer sometimes appeared to block her access, as if the system itself conspired against her. One night a new feed arrived without any accompanying email. The cabin in this feed was unlike the others, its door wide open, darkness spilling out into the snow-covered landscape. Rachel's heart pounded as she recognized something horrifying. The interior seemed to mirror her own apartment layout. Every detail, from the furniture to the placement of personal objects, was exactly as it was in her home. Panic surged, but she could not tear her eyes away. In the feed, shadows moved with a purpose, forming human-like shapes that appeared to step toward her apartment. Their faces obscured, yet unmistakably malevolent. The boundary between reality and the feeds blurred. Rachel began seeing figures, in her peripheral vision, vanishing when she turned to look. Her phone would display live streams she hadn't opened, showing angles of her own apartment she hadn't even noticed. It was as if the feeds were learning, observing, and adapting, feeding on her fear, meticulously predicting her reactions. The shadows began to whisper her name, soft at first, then louder, commanding her attention, drawing her toward doors and windows she never remembered leaving open. Rachel tried to destroy her devices, unplugging computers, smashing phones, and tearing out cables, but the feeds persisted. She realized the phenomenon was no longer confined to technology. It was as though the very walls of her apartment had become a conduit, a threshold between her world and the haunted cabins she had watched. Each shadow she glimpsed seemed to learn from her reactions, adapting, anticipating, and closing in. Sleep deprivation and terror warped her perception, leaving her unable to distinguish between her own actions and those imposed by the unseen entities. In desperation, Rachel followed a pattern she noticed among the feeds, tracing timestamps and geographic clues. They led her to a forgotten logging trail in the Appalachian Mountains, near a small, abandoned town marked on no modern maps. The cold wind cut through her clothes as she approached a decrepit cabin hidden among pines, the door ajar, the interior dark and foreboding. The air was thick with a sense of expectation, as if the cabin had been waiting for her, the shadows stretching unnaturally to greet her arrival. Inside, the layout was eerily familiar, every object, every corner matching the feed she had seen of her own apartment. She realized with mounting horror that the feeds were portals, conduits that connected the isolated locations with her reality. Each shadow an agent bridging dimensions, feeding on fear and curiosity. The walls seemed to pulse with a living presence, and the shadows began to take form, shaping into humanoid figures with hollow faces and unnerving movements. Rachel's own reflection appeared in the dusty glass, but it moved independently, gesturing toward a door in the back of the cabin, beckoning her. She understood that she had been lured into a trap, a convergence of worlds that preyed on those who watched, observed, and became too involved. The final hours blurred in a haze of terror. Rachel tried to flee, but the cabin seemed to stretch endlessly, hallways looping back upon themselves. The shadows advanced with precision, guiding her toward a central room filled with mirrors. As she approached, her reflection multiplied, each version screaming silently, pleading for release. One mirror reflected not her own image, but the shadows themselves, writhing and shifting, merging, learning. She understood the cruel truth. The feeds were not passive recordings, but invitations. Doors into a world where the watchers could step into reality. And the watched became prey. When authorities later investigated the abandoned cabin, they found it empty, no trace of Rachel except for her backpack near the entrance. Her computer and devices at home were gone, leaving no evidence of the feeds. The only clue was a new email in the inbox of an unknown recipient, subject line, "Do you want to see the truth?" and a single link. Somewhere, in the shadows, Rachel's presence lingered, a warning for the next curious mind. Let's move to our 10th story. It began with a sound no one else could hear. Marcus had always considered himself sensitive to unusual noises, but this was different to faint. A regular tapping echoing through his apartment late at night. At first, he dismissed it as pipes settling or a tree branch brushing against the window, but the tapping became increasingly rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone trying to communicate. Each night, it grew louder, sharper, more insistent, appearing in different corners of the apartment, as though moving with intelligence. Marcus tried recording it, but each playback revealed only static, punctuated by fleeting, indecipherable whispers that seemed to beckon him closer. One evening, the tapping synchronized with his heartbeat. When he followed the sound to the living room, he found nothing. No cracks in the walls, no loose panels, no hidden speakers, just shadows that seemed heavier, thicker, almost tangible. Over the following days, Marcus noticed subtle changes in his apartment. Objects slightly out of place. Reflections in mirrors that didn't match reality. Faint drafts of cold air in rooms that were perfectly sealed. It was as if the apartment itself had become a living entity, responding to him, observing him, learning his routines. The tapping evolved into patterns, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, repeating endlessly. A language he could not comprehend, but instinctively feared. Marcus attempted to record the pattern digitally, hoping to analyze it. But his equipment failed. Cameras would shut down abruptly, audio files corrupted, and even his phone's battery would drain unnaturally fast. Sleep became impossible. The tapping persisted in his dreams, now louder, now accompanied by shadowy figures looming over his bed, whispering promises of revelation and doom. Desperation led Marcus to investigate the history of the building. He discovered that decades ago, an occultist had lived on the very same floor, known for bizarre rituals involving sound frequencies and spiritual gateways. Legends spoke of the man vanishing without a trace, leaving behind a series of recordings that allegedly summoned entities from other dimensions. The realization hit Marcus like a thunderclap. The tapping was no ordinary sound. It was a conduit, a signal calling something to his reality. Something that had been waiting, patient, cunning, and hungry for his attention. The apartment began to distort around him. Walls shifted imperceptibly when he wasn't looking. Hallways extended into impossible angles, and the reflections in his mirrors multiplied, each version moving independently. At times, Marcus saw himself performing actions he had no memory of initiating, as though the tapping controlled not only the environment but also him. Shadows began to detach from their origins, crawling along walls and ceilings, converging in corners to watch silently. The whispers became intelligible, uttering phrases like "step closer," "hear the truth," "all is revealed." Marcus tried to ignore the tapping, but it became impossible. Even in public spaces, he thought he could hear faint echoes of the same pattern in distant streets or passing cars, as if the entity had expanded its influence beyond the apartment. He attempted to leave, but every exit seemed blocked, by physical means, but by a suffocating presence that disoriented him, bending perception and time. It became clear the tapping was a key, and he had entered a threshold that could not be exited by conventional means. One night, compelled by fear and curiosity, Marcus followed the sound into his bedroom closet, where it reached a deafening crescendo. Inside, he found a small, unmarked wooden box, ancient and weathered, emitting vibrations that resonated with the tapping. As he touched it, visions assaulted him, spectral landscapes of shadowy forests, long-abandoned ritual chambers, figures suspended mid-motion in ethereal pain, all pulsating in rhythm with the tapping. It was then he understood the box was a beacon, a device left by the occultist decades earlier, designed to bridge the world of the living with realms that thrived on fear and attention. Marcus attempted to destroy the box, smashing it with hammers and throwing it into the fireplace, but it remained intact, unyielding, as if mocking his efforts. The tapping intensified, now synchronized with a heartbeat that was not his own, pounding in the walls, the floor, the very air around him. Shadows surged, enveloping him, whispering secrets of the occultist's experiments, revealing glimpses of realities layered atop his own, each more horrifying than the last. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into incomprehensible eons. The final moments were a blur of sound and sensation. Marcus felt himself drawn into the box, his body dissolving into vibrations that merged with the tapping. His consciousness, fragmented across dimensions, simultaneously aware and powerless, witnessing himself trapped in every apartment and cabin he had ever known, each echoing the same rhythmic sound. When neighbors later entered the apartment, after hearing complaints about incessant noise, they found it empty. The box sat innocuously on the floor, closed, silent, and undisturbed. Yet, if one listened closely at night, a faint, irregular tapping could be heard, echoing through the walls, waiting for the next curious soul to answer its call. Let's move to our 11th story ever, since Julian moved into the old mountain lodge. He felt as if the air itself carried a whisper of secrets. The lodge, nestled high in the Appalachian Mountains, had been abandoned for decades, yet something about it seemed alive. Doors groaned as if struggling against unseen forces, and the wooden floors creaked with footsteps that Julian had not made. He chalked it up to the building settling and the wind outside, but late at night, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, unintelligible murmurs drifting through the halls, almost like the wind carrying fragments of conversations long forgotten. One evening Julian discovered a locked door in the attic, hidden behind a false wall. It bore no markings, just an ancient, rusted keyhole. His curiosity burned, even as a shiver ran down his spine, warning him to stop. That night, the whispers grew louder, sharper, forming words he could barely comprehend. Do not open. We are watching. You belong. Sleep eluded him, and each day felt heavier than the last. He began noticing subtle changes. The furniture seemed slightly rearranged in ways he didn't remember. Shadows lingering longer than natural, and the temperature dropping in areas of the lodge with no drafts. Unable to resist, Julian found an old skeleton key tucked behind a loose floorboard. With trembling hands, he inserted it into the attic door. The lock clicked open with a sound that reverberated unnaturally, echoing as if the building itself exhaled. Inside was a small room, untouched by time. Dusty journals and letters lay scattered across a wooden table, and a large mirror leaned against the far wall, its surface warped and darkened. Julian picked up a journal, and as he read, a story unfolded, a tale of previous occupants who had vanished mysteriously, each drawn into the mirror, never to return. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, urging him closer. Days passed, and Julian became obsessed with the mirror. Reflections in its surface were never quite accurate. Sometimes, he saw figures standing behind him, shadows in corners that vanished when he turned. At night, the whispering would crescendo, filling the room with countless voices murmuring in unison. He tried leaving the mirror covered, locked in the attic, but he would awaken to find it exposed, angled toward the bed, as if it had moved on its own accord. Desperation and fear twisted his mind. Julian realized that the mirror was not a passive object. It was a conduit, a portal that connected his reality to something ancient and malevolent, feeding on attention and curiosity. The more Julian interacted with the mirror, the more the lodge itself changed. Hallways extended and narrowed, doors led to rooms that weren't supposed to exist, and shadows grew more defined, taking on human-like forms that watched him silently. The journals hinted at rituals, instructions on how to communicate through the mirror safely, but their pages were fragmented, leaving him uncertain whether the guidance was genuine or a trap. He noticed scratches on the floor surrounding the mirror, forming patterns that seemed to shift overnight, leading him into a trance-like state whenever he followed them. One night, compelled by the mirror, Julian touched its surface. His reflection rippled like water, and he saw himself entering a dark, otherworldly version of the lodge, inhabited by figures draped in shadow, their faces blurred and grotesque. They whispered his name, beckoning him to step fully through. Panic surged, but his body moved involuntarily, drawn toward the reflection. The mirror's surface rippled again, and Julian found himself transported into the shadowed lodge, a distorted echo of the real one. Time flowed differently. Here minutes stretched into hours, and the walls seemed alive, breathing with the whispers of the missing dot in this twisted dimension. Julian encountered the souls of past occupants, trapped and hollow-eyed, repeating actions endlessly unable to escape. They reached for him silently, eyes pleading for release. The shadows began to converge, forming humanoid shapes that mirrored his every move, moving faster, closer, merging into a dark mass that pressed against his mind. He realized the mirror fed on the living, and his obsession had made him prey. Panic became clarity. He had to escape, or be consumed entirely. Desperation drove him to replicate the fragmented rituals from the journals, chanting phrases that sounded foreign and archaic. The shadows recoiled briefly, their forms flickering as if hesitant. Julian's own reflection in the mirror began to distort, contorting with expressions of fear, rage, and torment simultaneously. With a final surge of willpower, he lunged toward a doorway leading to what appeared to be the real world, shattering the mirror with a crash that echoed across both dimensions. Light flooded the space, and Julian tumbled onto the attic floor. Gasping, the mirror now a fractured, lifeless pane of glass. Even after escaping the mirror's grip, the lodge remained strange. Shadows still lingered in corners, and the whispering never fully ceased, muted but persistent. Julian packed his belongings and left, vowing never to return. Yet, in his dreams, he continued to hear the same voices, the same whispers, calling his name, guiding him back. Weeks later, the mirror appeared in an estate sale advertisement, antique full-length, mirror excellent condition, as if waiting patiently for the next curious soul. Julian knew, deep in his heart, that the lodge's shadows and whispers had only found a temporary lull. They would rise again, patiently seeking the next observer willing to pay attention. Let's move to our 12th story. Started with a phone call no one should have received. Alina had moved into a small, isolated cabin in the woods of the Appalachian Mountains, seeking solitude and inspiration for her writing. The area was remote, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to absorb light, casting perpetual shadows even during the day. The first call came at midnight, a distorted voice whispering her name, but the line was dead the moment she tried to respond. Initially, she dismissed it as a prank or a malfunction, but the calls continued nightly, each one growing more urgent and insistent, often repeating phrases she could barely comprehend. "They are coming. Don't sleep. Don't look outside." Unease deepened when she discovered small scratches along the cabin walls. Subtle at first, but progressively more pronounced. The air inside felt heavier, as though the forest itself pressed against the windows. Every creak in the wooden floors echoed like footsteps, but she lived alone. She began keeping a journal, documenting the disturbances, hoping that logic would bring comfort. Yet each entry was met with another unsettling phenomenon. Objects rearranged themselves. Her belongings appeared moved, and at times, she would awaken to find messages scrawled in condensation on the windows, often in handwriting she did not recognize, spelling out warnings she could not ignore. One night, drawn by a strange compulsion, she opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch. The forest was unnervingly silent. The wind had died down, and the usual nocturnal sounds were absent. Yet the darkness seemed to pulse, almost alive, as if the trees themselves were watching her. She noticed distant shapes moving between the trunk stall, thin, featureless figures that glided rather than walked. Panic surged, but her body remained rooted, mesmerized by the unnatural silhouettes. They disappeared as soon as she blinked, yet the feeling of being observed persisted, lingering in the space between her heartbeat Alina began experiencing time distortions. Hours would pass in what felt like seconds, and moments of clarity were punctuated by episodes where the cabin seemed to stretch impossibly, hallways lengthening, corners twisting into impossible angles. Her journal entries became erratic, describing visions of past residents trapped in the forest, their faces etched with terror, silently screaming, reaching toward her from shadowed spaces. She realized that the cabin was not merely haunted. It was a threshold, a nexus where dimensions overlapped, and the forest was a conduit for entities that existed beyond the natural world. In a moment of desperate clarity, Alina attempted to leave. But each path out of the cabin led back to the same clearing, as if the forest itself had folded in on her. She noticed patterns in the movements of the shadowed figures, subtle but deliberate, almost guiding her deeper into the woods. At the center of the forest lay an ancient stone circle, half buried in moss, its surface etched with symbols that radiated a faint, unnatural glow. The whispers were louder here, voices layering on top of one another, urging her to step inside the circle. Her rational mind screamed to flee, but curiosity and fear intertwined, compelling her to approach. The moment she entered the stone circle, the air vibrated with a frequency she could feel in her bones. Shadows coalesced into humanoid forms, more defined and menacing than ever, circling her slowly. The whispering became a chant, each word vibrating in resonance with the symbols on the stones. Alina's perception fractured. She saw multiple versions of herself moving independently, trapped in loops of the same fear, some reaching for the shadows, others fleeing endlessly. The entities seemed drawn to her presence, feeding on her terror and curiosity alike. Desperate, Alina tried to disrupt the circle, kicking stones and breaking the symbols etched into the moss. The shadows recoiled briefly, but quickly reformed, more aggressive, surrounding her entirely. She felt herself being pulled toward the center, an invisible force urging her to merge with the circle. Her vision blurred, and the world around her twisted into a kaleidoscope of forest, shadows, and stone, each moment stretching infinitely. The voices intensified, echoing her deepest fears, revealing truths about the forest and the cabin, about the nature of reality and the entities that dwelled beyond perception. In the final moments, Alina realized that escape was impossible. The forest and its inhabitants had claimed her attention, and in doing so, they claimed her. Her consciousness fragmented, merging with the shadows, becoming another watcher in the dark, whispering warnings to future wanderers. Weeks later, hikers reported seeing a faint silhouette near the cabin, standing silently at the edge of the trees, watching. Some claimed to hear faint, distorted whispers when passing by, calling their names, warning them not to enter. The cabin remained untouched by time, waiting patiently for the next curious soul to stumble into the forest's embrace, ensuring that the cycle of terror continued, endless and inevitable.